Hi, it's me, Ingrid P. And the seagulls started shouting right when I was trying to make this video, but they haven't stopped since. So I guess we'll just have to deal with them shouting in the background. Yeah, so I've made a video about neural pruning, and I was thinking, maybe I should make a video about monotropism and such, but I'm not an expert on these things. So I'll just first make a little summary of these different theories about autism and ADHD, and then how this links to MBTI. And so neural pruning is the theory or the observations that they made from studies that neurotypical children, as they grow up, will start pruning, basically like cutting off synapses in the brain from when you're born, with a lot of neurons, a lot of nerve cells, and a lot of synapses between the cells, a lot of chemical information being exchanged, to a more streamlined version where you are working on certain things and not other things, So in a neurotypical brain, there will be certain neural pathways that will be preferred than others, and that will develop during childhood. While in neurodivergent brains, the pathways will be different, and there will be less pruning and more just like keeping all of these unnecessary connections. And that's what makes the focus on things and the skills that are developed are different. So there's that. Then there's another theory that's called Monotropism, which is that the focus in people with autism and ADHD is focused on one thing at a time rather than many broad things at once. And that there's difficulty with regulating the focus, which can seem a little bit contradictory, but because of the ADHD, like an ADHD person can't really focus on many things at the same time, even though it seems like it. It's more like they have a flashlight and they're like jumping from one point to the other. And so somehow these two things seem very contradictory, but they seem to be both explaining symptoms of autism and ADHD. Of course, this is very complex. There's probably tons of other reasons about there. But it seems like on one hand, there's not enough neural pruning, so the nerve cell system is extremely interconnected in a neurodivergent person. And because there's not that streamlining process. And at the same time, it seems that there's monotropism, which is basically that the attention is very focused on one thing at a time, rather than like being able to see with a wide ray of light. So these things seem to not be really understandable, I guess. It's hard to reconcile one theory with the other theory, but somehow both theories, I can see how they're true. But if you think about how these things are, it is kind of how judging and perceiving is, I guess. And how there's both introverted judging functions and extroverted judging functions, and introverted perceiving functions and extroverted perceiving functions. Now, I'm just making all this up on the spot, okay? I haven't planned for this video. So bear with me. But I'm thinking how we talk about how certain things are focused and certain things are expanding and certain things are contracting, I guess, such as how introverted functions compress things, I guess, and extroverted things expand, at least in terms of the perceiving functions, where the perceiving functions is, but it's also for the judging functions as well, actually. But most of the perceiving functions, where like NI and SI are funneling everything into a funnel, and NE and SE are like like taking in all of these things, and expanding on a certain thing. Same thing goes for introverted feeling and introverted thinking are very focused sort of things, but extroverted feeling and thinking are also kind of focused, but I guess that they're like trying to implement it outward. So this theory does not work as well, I guess, for the judging functions, but for the perceiving functions it really does. Like, what information do you take in and what do you focus on? And I guess that the judging functions are how it comes out. But since neurodivergence is more about how we process information and how, rather than like how we act, it would make sense that it's more like the perceiving functions that affect this. So, I mean, the typical example is an NE user that has ADHD, right? A lot of expansion, a lot of connecting the dots, a lot of ideas, right? And that's the lack of neural pruning, right? But every NE user is also an SI user. And so maybe that ADHD person has these certain hobbies or that they like to hyperfixate on, from their past, that they really like. I don't know. I'm just thinking of like, a high NE user doing this. So that's for the NE user, I guess. But an SI dominant can also have ADHD. But I guess that's, so somehow there is a balance between taking in a lot of information and where the brain decides to focus. It's perceptions of the world. So I think that there is, when we're talking about cognition, what is cognition, There's the cognitive functions, right, in MBTI, but there's also executive dysfunction, cognitive functions in neurodevelopmental disability, neurodiversity, our cognition is different. And that's where it's interesting putting MBTI and other psychological things together with MBTI. I don't really have a theory about this, but it is interesting that in brain development, in psychology, in the science of cognition and neuroscience and everything, there is this, we are still talking about, we're using different words, we have slightly different definitions, but it's all about how you process information and how you decide from that information and what skills you develop from that, and what are your strengths and weaknesses from that, and like what you need extra help with, and there's slightly different flavors according to what you're talking about. Like for MBTI, it's like, oh, this is your primary function that you're really good at, and this one is like you're worse at, and you need to work on your least developed cognitive functions and all that. And in the world of ADHD and autism, it's more like, oh, what are the accommodations to deal with the difficulties that you have? How can you work on these difficulties because of your brain structure? But everything is about brain structure, and like, what does a brain do? And here we're thinking of brains as kind of like a computer rather than like a soul, okay? Because, well, that's how we can break things down and make things more comprehensible to us. But essentially what the brain does is that it takes in information in different forms, right? Abstract, sensory, concrete, from our senses, from our the information that we get from other people telling us things, all that. How we process all of that afterwards, and how we make sense of that. That's how MBTI works, right? It goes through the whole loop of that. It comes in through our extroverted perceiving functions, or the senses, and then it goes through this whole processing, and then it goes through the judgment functions, and then it gets processed out. So that's how it works in MBTI. When it comes to ADHD and autism, there is difficulties in the processing. It's differences in processing compared to other people. Differences in how sensitive you are, how much you take in, and what you take in, and how you process that, and how you organize that in your head, and then how you use that information to manage in the world. And so I think that there could be a use to having MBTI coupled to neurodivergence in how we can help people, first of all, manage the world, and also make the world a better place that accepts people who have different neurotypes. Because ultimately I think that these things are not completely different. These things, or they are different, but I mean that they are not completely unrelated, These are things that do have to deal with the brain and psychology, and they do have to deal with how to help people in their daily lives. And it would be interesting to be able to incorporate these things somehow. I don't know how. I mean, I'm not the person who's going to do this, but I do think that I'm a person who has done a lot of research about ADHD and autism online and through my work. I haven't written papers on the subject, right? I'm not a researcher. But I think that I've learned a lot about this kind of stuff. And I've learned a lot about MBTI through having been in the MBTI community on and off since 15 years back, and read a lot of the texts that have been online. I haven't read books about it though, that I will admit, but I have looked at different excerpts throughout the years. And I don't know, I think that it would be interesting to put these things together and to see that these things are not actually that different. I do believe that we can put these things together, right? It won't be like a perfect fit. It will be kind of shaky, you know, but that's how it is whenever you try to incorporate two systems together. I think it's also interesting to find out, like, how do we become our conscious being self, you know? How do we become the people that we are, with the personalities that we have, with the strengths and weaknesses that we have, you know? There's the genetics, there's the nature versus nurture stuff, and there's also just the fact that we are sentient beings, you know. Completely a crazy thing, you know, but you know, you could incorporate spirituality into it as well if you went to, you know. A lot of things, I still do not really understand how these two theories of monotropism and neuropruning can go together. But I just saw the connection between these things and some MBTI concepts, such as, you know, how certain functions are more rational because they are from the outside, and irrational because they are subjective from the inside, and how external information gets treated into this funnel and processed and then comes out. And that's a little bit what I think the neural pruning is, basically how there's a lot of connections, and how autistic and an ADHD person is maybe more sensitive to different things around them, which can be all sorts of information. It can be sensory information, but it can also be like people information. It can also be like different ideas and thoughts. And then and so therefore the ADHD or autism person will focus their energy in a different way, and they'll focus their focus on something different than a neurotypical person would, and that will lead to hyperfixations, or that will lead to problems with memory, or, you know, other problems, or strengths. And the processing of stuff will be different. There might be difficulties, such as how ADHD people or autistic people have difficulties processing emotions. So there is a lot of internal stuff going on, and as is like MBTI has, you know, the introverted feeling is one of these processing functions, introverted thinking as well, introverted perceiving is, these are the introvert functions, I guess. NI and SI as well are like kind of funneling things down, and then it comes out, and that's where I'm not really sure about how it manifests in autism and ADHD, but I do think that it comes out in, you know, we want to all do things that make sense, that are logical, and that feel right to us, and that make us feel like we have a meaningful life. And then we want to implement that in the world through FE or TE. So we go from FI, TI to FE, right? The judgment functions. And I think that it can be difficult for ADHD people to get into that state of, like, because of their difficulties to do that big impact. But once they get there, it can have a huge impact. But I don't really understand the whole situation yet. I understand how this could explain the first part of it with taking in the information that is less affected by pruning than neurotypical people are, and how monotropism can explain the narrowing it down process that happens with ADHD and autism. However, I do want to believe that ADHD and autistic people are able to make good decisions for themselves and to implement these things. But I do think that there might be a little bit difficulty there. And so maybe that's where ADHD and autism, maybe there's another theory about ADHD and autism, about how it's difficult for people with ADHD to organize their lives, for example. Or maybe it is the lack of neuropruning again. That means that it's difficult to organize this stuff into something that is applicable in real life due to executive dysfunction things. I'm trying to think about autism, how that would be affected. I do think that maybe the theory of monotropism would explain like how the information would be taken in and processed. But of course, no theory can explain everything, you know. There is this thing with autism that is about repetitive things, and I think that has to do with the monotropism thing. And what is the difference between autism and ADHD? How do you get one and not the other, or how do you get both? You know, I think there might be like a certain palette that is more towards the ADHD side and a palette that is a little more to the autistic side. And if you have like a mix of those two Venn diagram circles, then you have both. And so maybe the neuropruning thing is a little bit more of an ADHD thing, according to my theorizing. I'm not even, I don't know why I'm theorizing about this. Anyway, maybe lack of neuropruning would give rise to ADHD, while monotropism would give rise to autism. And you could have these two things together, and that would lead to but there are people with ADHD only who also have problems with monotropism, and people with autism only who only have who also have difficulties with who also have less neuropruning. So we don't really know what we're talking about, right? We don't know what is what are our definitions of these different things. All of this is just theory. But it would be interesting to understand how these things would work, because maybe we'd also be able to explain some MBTI stuff. And maybe some MBTI stuff could explain some ADHD and autism stuff. It's not that far-fetched, you know. I know that MBTI is seen as like an old and outdated and non-scientific theory, which, sure, but that's why we use models. We use models to understand things better. And monotropism is one such model, you know. And the neurodivergence model is one such model. And gender is also, there's also this kind of model, but it's not 100% indicative of what reality is, but it's a way for us to make sense of the world. So maybe one day we will make more sense of autism and ADHD and MBTI types and personality and psychology and everything. But we're not there yet. So I'm going to end this video now and go home. So have a great day, everybody. Bye.